Yeah, I come from a media studies background, working at Edge University in the UK, and it says their TV Studies Research Group. Also a member of the Centre for Human Animal Studies that's based at Edge Hill University, which sits in the Arts and Humanities faculty, but also does connect outside of that to kind of scientists, social scientists, and so on. And I think I'm going to say the same that everybody has said before all of the talks, which is I feel like I'm coming at this from a completely different angle compared to everybody else, but obviously that's kind of the point of a network like this, Carrie. So well done on bringing together people, I think, that very often wouldn't necessarily sort of bump into each other. So yeah, I have a media studies background, but specifically television studies, thinking about television as a particular medium and television as having particular kind of social functions, particular kinds of genres, which are not separate from other forms of culture, but are particular and specific. And I put the cover of my book there, Animals on Television, at least partly because I still love that cover and I can't believe the publishers agreed to go with that cover. And in that book, that kind of covers lots of different genres on television, and thinking about the ways in which animals are represented. And I guess representation is kind of a key idea that I'm thinking through in terms of television and the ways in which television tells stories. This, to me, seems to have a kind of interesting relationship to fables, where many people have pointed to a definition of fables as forms of storytelling with some kind of moral purpose or some kind of teaching purpose. And television, obviously not in all countries, but in many countries, as a component of public service broadcasting, is kind of interesting because it means it's a form of culture that is mandated in many countries to have some form of moral purpose. And the word moral isn't kind of normally used, but it may be that other forms of culture, literature and art and theatre and so on, clearly people who produce those things and people who consume those things might understand them in a moral context. But public service broadcasting is interesting, as I say, because it's mandated to do that, and it is assessed in terms of doing it. And so you have these forms of culture in broadcasting which are required to adopt some kind of moral form of storytelling or deal with virtues or bring the society together and all that kind of thing. And that's quite odd in terms of the ways in which we think about culture. And so that could be an interesting way of thinking about the kinds of stories that are being told, where public service broadcasting is assessed in particular ways, different, I think, from many other forms of culture that don't have those regulations placed upon them. And one of the places I was thinking about related to that, which is very significant in terms of animals, is clearly children's television. And, you know, there's an interesting distinction certainly in kind of Western and European and global North cultures where children's culture is very, very comfortable telling stories in which animals are characters, and adults' culture is much less comfortable doing that. The movement to adulthood is typically a movement away from stories about children. But programs like Peppa Pig and one of the greatest television programs ever made, Bluey, clearly have moral purposes coming out of public service broadcasters, inviting children and their parents to engage in kind of moral debates, to think about what it is to be a good person, what it means to be part of a society, the complexity of everyday life, movement from childhood to adulthood. And so these kinds of programs are constantly telling stories which are thinking about stories that are constructed about ideas of morals. And I don't know whether these are things that we would typically call fables, but the definition that people have repeatedly offered, which is stories that have a kind of moral purpose to them, then clearly we could understand lots of children's television in that way. The other thing I wanted to think about was thinking about factual animals and the ways in which factual animals are turned into stories. And actually, this is my entry point into thinking about animals on television, which was a bunch of work I did on wildlife documentaries. And clearly, documentaries sit in an interesting place where they purport to have a scientific basis and work with scientists and so on. yet they are constructed within ways in which storytelling kind of happens. They draw on genres of kind of action cinema, soap opera, and so on in order to kind of tell their stories. There's a set of kind of moral debates about wildlife documentary in terms of the ways in which they're made, but also the ways in which animals are used within such stories to construct ideas of morality. So ideas of nature, and obviously nature in massive inverted commas, and the ways in which what is natural in society, and that there is that kind of idea that some people use, which is things that are not natural, again in inverted commas, in the non-human world, we should not consider as natural. In terms of the human world, I guess many of us would critique that, but there is a way in which these kinds of stories are sort of turned to in order to kind of construct what is a kind of natural morality. And so thinking about the storytelling that's done there, some of which, and particularly in terms of contemporary environmental concerns, is very about our planet and the impact of humans upon ecosystems and other beings on the planet, is clearly constructed in moral terms. And then just to finish off, the third kind of way in which I'm exploring these things, and it connects to some work that other people just talking about, Matthew just talking about kind of creative work, is thinking about creative approaches to these kinds of questions. The ways in which I've been thinking about that is rewritings of existing things. So what happens if you take something that's already an animal story, but which is clearly an anthropocentric animal story, and rewrite it? Where does that kind of get us in a disruptive way? And the thing that I've got coming out soon is taking the film Jaws. And what happens if you take the film Jaws, which I presume you all know, and retell the story from the shark's point of view, which is clearly not the point of view that we are positioned in as a viewing audience, and the pleasures we're offered from that film, and not really to be on the shark's side. And so, yeah, there's conference papers have done this, but also a version that's coming out soon, which is just a monologue from the shark, kind of questioning the film, questioning the way they are represented, but also actually questioning the ways in which there's lots of academics writing on Jaws, questioning the ways in which academic writing is constructed the shark. And so I'm kind of exploring this and thinking about a whole set of kind of animals that are represented in film and television, and what happens if you take the stories they are in and rewrite them from their point of view. Clearly there's a problem here, the speaking on behalf of problem, and so there's tensions that exist within that. So the question of speaking on behalf of a fictional animal might be understood slightly differently of speaking on behalf of a kind of factual one. But the aim here, as I say, primarily is to kind of be disruptive, is to say, here's a story which is clearly understood in a particular way. What happens if we kind of invert that? Where does that get us? And what might that do in terms of kind of human understandings of non-human beings? So I'll finish there. Thanks.